Hello everybody, Neffertity here. Okay, so the Plushie tutorial video that I posted a while back got so much more attention than I was anticipating. Like, seriously, I cannot thank you guys enough for all your outstanding support, your wonderful feedback, and I love hearing how you're taking my advice to make your own plushies. Seriously, that's so cool. This video was just amazing to see the community feedback from it, and if you guys did make something using it, please feel free to shoot me an email with the pictures attached, because I would absolutely love to have a video where I cover what you guys have created using my advice, because that would just be super amazing. That being said though, there were some things I really wanted to cover in the video, but either I twingle-dingus forgot, or I just didn't see it as being a super necessary thing at the time, and it escaped my mind. But I feel this would be a good video to kind of address that, especially because it's a longer one, so if you enjoy longer videos, then this is perfect. You can just put it on and listen to my vocal cords vibrating into a microphone in the background. But if you don't like longer videos, I'm sorry. I'll try to make shorter videos in the future. I sped this one up as much as I can, but it's still pretty long, so I'm sorry. The first thing I wanted to talk about is tracing your patterns. For most of the time, you want to try and use a washable marker or some kind of tailor's chalk in order to trace your patterns. I personally prefer to use a Sharpie of a similar color to whatever fabric color I'm using to trace my patterns. That way I know for certain where my lines are, and I can sew along them cleanly when I run them through my machine. I can make sure that they're perfectly symmetrical just by looking at them. But something really important to keep in mind is when you're doing this, try to pick a permanent marker that's a similar color to what you're trying to make. So for example, if you're tracing on green fabric, try to use a dark green marker. If you're tracing on yellow fabric, try to use an orange or a red marker. Try to pick colors that are similar. Because right here you can see I'm using a black marker on white fabric, which is like a big no-no. Like, please only do this if you're absolutely certain you know what you're doing, which in my case right here, this character has black markings that touch white markings. Therefore, using a black marker is okay, because I can hide it in the seam allowance. If your character is solid white, please, 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 don't use black marker on white, because what happens is over time the black marker will actually bleed through the fabric and you'll get this weird staining effect that you cannot get rid of. Like, I made a plushie years and years ago that it was like that. It bled through and it just looked super ugly and nasty and just, oh my, it was so bad. I felt so bad. Another thing you can do is if your character has really small markings on it, like this one, you can mirror the images and make one solid piece. Since when I do my patterns, I usually do two-part patterns, meaning you just sandwich the two pieces directly together. It's two symmetrical halves to make one whole 3D shape. If you mirror your images like this by tracing one half, flipping your pattern, and then tracing the other where the other line ended, it will make one perfect piece that will cover the entire span of both halves. I like to do this for really small and intricate markings because I find that it's just really irritating to try and match them up otherwise. And this right here was the big one. I had so many people that asked me, how did you attach the two different colors? What's the blanket stitch? How did you use the blanket stitch when doing this? This is how. You take the two good sides of the plush, which will be on the outside, and you sandwich them together so that they the good sides touch each other, but there's a seam right on the middle where they touch. You then sew with the blanket stitch along this seam all the way across. With flatter pieces, you can sometimes run these through the machine and it will save you so much time and it will really, really hide your stitching, which looks phenomenal. But for some things, there's either too tight of a curve or it's just too small of a surface area for you to run it through your machine and you have to hand sew. And if you don't have a machine and you just hand sew the whole plush, then, you know, props to you because that takes forever. But this is how you do the blanket stitch for the two different colors. You just slowly work your way along. I like to use my clips to make sure my fabric doesn't shift around a lot, because it will try to shift, especially if it's fleece. Fleece is a fiddly material that likes to slide on itself. But you just blanket stitch all the way along this edge, and as soon as it's done, make sure you get a nice secure knot in the end, and then you can fold the pieces over and kind of stretch out the seam to test it and make sure that it doesn't come apart. If you do see that there's big old holes that open up, you need to go back through and readjust your stitches. But you can see that by doing that, it makes it nice and flat. You can then repeat this for every single piece that has two colors touching each other. I usually tend to do this on much bigger areas because I find that smaller markings are better just to be ladder stitched to the plushie. It's personal preference. I am still learning plushies myself, so I don't have a whole lot of experience doing really intricate markings and stuff like that. I've seen some that are run through the machine and they have this like almost an embroidered edge on the markings that I think just look phenomenal, and I really wish I could learn how to do that. In time, I'm sure I will, but for the time being, it's still one of those skills that elude me, and I really want to learn how, because embroidery looks beautiful and it feels beautiful on the hand, because you can't feel like any one particular stitch. You can only feel just a solid, smooth shape, and it just looks amazing. It's seriously so cool. If you have an embroidery machine, I'm so jealous. Someday I'll have one. I tried to include as much of these part attachments as possible for you guys, just so that you could get a better idea of how to do it. I personally feel that the best way I can learn something is by watching it done, and then after watching it so many times, my brain just goes, oh yeah, now I know what to do. Easy peasy. And the ability sort of comes to me, and then once I have that base ability, I can hone in on it and modify it as needed. You just work your way through this process, doing each one until you eventually finish all the individual pieces. This is definitely something that will change for how long it takes, depending on what the character's markings look like. The most irritating markings to do are stripes. Like, oh boy, some of the stripes that I've seen are just, oh, they break my brain. Rainbow stripes, all those connecting colors take so long to do. Ooh. But they can be super duper worth it just because of how pretty they look. If you put the effort in, it will definitely show with your work, and over time, it'll just get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner as you practice more. So if plushies are something that you really want to get good at, whether it's to sell them or just to make them for yourself or for friends as gifts or whatever, definitely just keep on practicing and try and push your skills. Once you get comfortable doing something, that's usually about the time when you have to try and challenge yourself to do something new. Once we've got all those pieces blanket stitched together, we can then start running them through the machine. With bits right here, like these horns, I always run horns through the machine just because I want them to be extra super duper secure and stable. And a lot of times, you can't really get that with hand sewing, but if you do not have a machine, like I've always said, you can hand sew plushies. Like, it's not impossible, it just takes a lot more time because you have to usually double stitch everything just to make sure that it's totally secure. I also machine sew my horns for my plushies because I stuff them really firmly so they don't distort their shapes at all. So that is something to keep in mind. If you intend to make something super duper firm, your stitches have to be able to take that. This next portion here that I'm working on are the wings. This, I don't think, was something I included in the last video, either because I lost the footage or because it was just feathered wings, and they're not the same as these traditional dragon wings that you see here. But basically, once I hand sew the main marking area, then I can move into physically sewing the edges. Try to keep your shapes very loose and bubbly at this stage. Don't have super tight, sharp corners like this, otherwise it will actually distort the fabric when you try to turn it inside out. This is something I've definitely learned the hard way, so take my advice and make sure that your corners are nice and soft as you sew. You can always adjust them later on. I also apologize for the graveliness of my voice. I've been getting over a really bad chest cold, so my my vocal cords haven't quite recovered all the way, so I'm not quite the cheery, bubbly, enthusiastic voice that I normally keep. But, you know, we'll work through it. I really debated on omitting these large sewing segments, but I figured I would include them just for you guys to watch, and because it also gives me a bit of a minute to talk about some important things regarding plushies, which is if you intend to sew anything, you have to include seam allowance. I've learned this so many times the hard way just because I'm like, oh, I know what I'm doing. I don't need no stinking seam allowance. You do, trust me. You really do. It varies immensely depending on the size of whatever it is you're sewing, but I personally find for plushies of the size that I make, usually about, I will say 1/8 of an inch is enough seam allowance, especially if it's going through the machine, because the machine will always eat a bit of the edge no matter what you do. It's just unavoidable. You can also see here with these feet how the black piece was previously sewed, and then I'm going back through the white. Try to match your thread color to the color of the fabric that you're sewing. While the machine does hide stitches really well, you can still see them pop through every so often. So try and just match your thread color as possible, as much as possible. And if you are hand sewing, this is even more so important, because with hand sewing, you will always see your stitches. There's just no way to hand sew something that you won't see them. Human hands just can't pull the thread tight enough in order to hide them. Once you get all your pieces sewn up, then you can begin the tediously long process of turning the fabric inside out. Some days this is better than others. It is stupidly time consuming though, especially if a character has lots and lots of parts. I find the most irritating things to turn are feathers. That's usually why when I make feathered wings on my plushies, I make them out of a solid piece of felt that's just layered to give the illusion of being feathers, because I'm not going to spend the time turning each individual feather inside out, because they end up just looking like a bunch of really weird noodles, especially at this scale. Like, sewing intricate wings is nearly impossible for something of this size. At least for me, anyway. I'm sure there's artists out there that can do it, but I am not one of said artists. The tail is also one of the more hard things to turn inside out. I find a trick that you can do is if you start with the tail tip and kind of just like shove it up into the fabric, it really makes it easier to slide the whole thing inside out. I don't know why. I think I may have picked up the wrong type of fleece, because this black material that I have turned out way tighter than it should have been, and I have no idea why. Like, I've never had this problem with the black material in the past. It's just specifically this batch. I feel like it might not be anti-pill fleece, it may be blizzard fleece or something of the kind. I usually prefer to use anti-pill or heavyweight winter fabric when it comes to making plushies, just because it's like super duper plush and the edges tend to be a little bit thicker, so you see less of the fabric pulling apart when you have to stretch pieces out, like in the horns especially. It really shows in the horns. Fabric is fiddly, but fleece is forgiving. Ain't that a fun alliteration? Once you have all your pieces turned inside out, you can then begin adding the small details like stitching the face onto the body. I always make sure that I attach my face separately for 2 reasons. One, I can reposition the angle of the face to better suit what it is I'm trying to give the character's expression, because you always kind of want to make their head point down a little bit. It will look much better in photos if you do so. That way it will always be looking straight at the camera, and it just gives it this natural kind of just aloof stance. It also allows you to have this itty bit of seam allowance here on the edges, so that when you go to stuff the head, it will poof out the cheeks a little bit more, and it'll help pull that 3-dimensional shape in. If you don't want to do this, you could always just do 2 complete halves with the face, and then you can put a thin fabric strip that goes from the nose to the back of the head. This will also help to create that 3D looking face effect. But I find personally that is a little bit harder to do and to get just the right measurements in there. So, fiddle around with it and see what you can do. Everybody has their own particular plush crafting style. I'm also sorry for the lighting that is absolutely wrecking this white fabric. That is one of the big issues that comes with having white and black fabric on something. It always completely wrecks your camera's ratio for color contrasting, because it's like, do I focus on the black and make the screen brighter, or do I focus on the white and make the screen darker? And the camera just doesn't know what to do. This was also filmed very late at night, hence why I have to turn on my bright light. I try to film as much during the day as I possibly can, but plushies take a long time. That's why you may notice that my shirt actually changed several times throughout this video. I think I spent a good 3 days working on this plushie, so it is not a swift process. There we go, that's the word I was after. I swear I have a brain, it works sometimes. Always remember too to leave a hole big enough to turn the plush inside out of itself. I usually leave the top of the head open or right underneath the chin, because that gives me enough room to be able to work with it. Once you've inside it out, then you can pin it in place and take a look at it. I believe on this one, I think I left the booty open. It was either the booty or the top of the head. I think it was the top of the head. Yeah. I cannot remember. This footage was shot way longer ago than it should have been. I've been very busy working on some special stuff, so I'll talk more about that at the end of the video, so stay tuned if you're interested in possibly learning how you can get yourself a free plushie from me, because there's an opportunity coming up for that. Once everything's all turned inside out, then you can begin the very long process of stuffing the plushie. I prefer to use polyfill, and something kind of neat you can do with polyfill is if you want your plushie to be really soft and squishy, when you pull out a big old clump of it, kind of stretch it out a little bit and pull apart the fibers with your hands as if you're stretching apart dough or ripping up paper. Because when you do this, it will add more air between the fibers, which will in turn poof them out and make them appear bigger, so that when you stick them into the plushie, they take up more space and thus result in a much more firmly stuffed plush, but it's also still squishy, which is always wonderful. Some important areas to super stuff are areas like the neck and the head. If you don't want your shapes to be really distorted, take extra fluff and put it into those places to help prevent it from going all floppy and just looking kind of meh. Once the plushie is stuffed mostly to your heart's content, you can then stitch up the top of the head in order to seal all that fluffy goodness inside. Now you may notice that the shape of the head is a little bit distorted here, and that's because I haven't completely stuffed it full yet. I always leave a little bit of a gap at the top so that I can stuff it as firm as I need to, and then I can bridge the gap later on. I also had this piece that was attached to the markings that I wanted to make absolutely sure was going to fit perfectly onto the head. So I left this gap at the back so that when I could attach this, I could pin it all down in place and stretch it to fit. Normally with a marking of this size, I would have sewn it into the pattern itself, but because of the particular shape of this one and the way that it wrapped around the neck, I was really unsure if it was going to work the way I wanted it to, so I just wanted to take that extra precaution and attach it secondarily. In retrospect, I probably could have made it work, but, you know, it is what it is. I did it this way. It took a little bit longer, but it came out super cool, and I'll show you guys at the end of the video what this plush looked like, because it did come out super cute, and I was so happy with how it looked. I also totally killed the person it was for. He was so blown away and happy. This was a birthday gift that I did for the person because they've been an outstanding supporter of mine for just years. They're super incredibly patient and wonderful to work with. They always have really cool commission ideas. And I love the elegance that the simplicity of their character is. You don't always have to be a super complex character in order to look pretty. You can be just, you know, a simple 2-color character. Very monochrome, but it can be done well. You'll notice that I always tie off my thread when I get to the 2 little black parts right here on the cheek where the marking connects. I always do this just to be 100% sure that everything is connecting the way that it's supposed to. It's kind of a personal thing that I do, but I always fear that my plushie markings are going to peel up at some point or another. So I try to take that extra caution and tie it off at the top just so that it doesn't go anywhere. Maybe it's just my own personal paranoia, but I feel like it's happened in the past and that's why I always do this. But it is a good idea to always kind of tie a knot every so often so that just in case you get a stitch that pops, it doesn't peel the entire thing apart. Rather, it'll just pop for a couple of areas and then you can come back and patch that if need be. Just a slow process of hand sewing and attaching the markings, work your way around until eventually you can move on to the finished piece. And then we can stuff the legs. I like to use polyfill. I do notice that a lot of people couldn't find polyfill, which there is an alternative you can use, which is actually fish tank sand or those fish tank rocks. You can use fish tank rocks because they are waterproof. So if you ever have to wash your plushie, you know, it's not going to distort the material. It won't cause mold to grow or anything like that. It is always important to keep in mind of whatever you stuff your plush with. Make sure that it is water safe and that it's not going to trap moisture inside it. Because if it does, that can cause mold to grow, which is a big no-no. I find the biggest offender of this is foam scraps. I have seen a couple people that will just take excess foam from like First Aid Making or something, and they'll stuff their plushies with that because they just don't have anything else. I would strongly advise against using foam or any kind of paper product to stuff because it can cause mold to grow when moisture gets trapped in it. So do take that precaution. You don't want to cause your plushie to get covered in mold. Like, that would be terrifying. Certain areas are also really frustrating to fill. Like, the tail here was weirdly tight and I was having so much difficulty getting the beans to get down in there. But with enough wiggling and jiggling and motivating, you can get it to go in there. It just takes some patience. I usually fill my tails for my plushies almost completely with my polyfill beans because I like them to be a little bit weighty. I feel like it helps to balance everything out, and it also adds like a snuggly weight to the plush, which is quite fabulous, you know? I personally like my plushies to have that little bit of weight to them. I just find that it makes them feel really nice, and it also makes their tails super duper wiggly, which is always wonderful. And then we move into stuffing things like the horns. I always super duper firmly stuff my horns just because I want them to be nice and solid, and I don't want them to lose their shape at any point in time. So I do always go through and make sure that I stuff them extra firmly. Sorry it's not mostly on camera here. I was trying my hardest, but getting a camera to sit where you want it to sit when you're trying to work is super hard. Like, I feel like I need to strap a GoPro to my forehead or something when I'm crafting because I'm always shifting around and moving stuff closer to my face because I'm nearly blind. Once you get all your pieces stuffed, you can then move into finally attaching all the pieces, which is super satisfying to do. Like, this is one of my most favorite things to do with plushies. I usually start by attaching the tail just because I want to get a nice drape on it. I try to line up the center seam right with the center of the body, as well as the seam on the back of the tail with the seam that goes down the spine. It's not necessary, but for symmetry purposes, my brain is like, yes, this is nice. I like it when things line up properly. And then it's just a matter of ladder stitching the tail onto the plush. Always make sure that you go under and over the main stitch line because that will help it to not come apart or pop your stitches, especially if you're hand sewing things. It sort of adds this like extra secured layer there, which is super duper important on a high stress area like the legs or the tail. Things to keep in mind, you know, but practice will definitely make perfect and help in that aspect. You may also notice that the area where the tail is attached is kind of loose. If it does look a little bit kind of caved in right there, you can always come and stick some extra fabric in there, or you can kind of fill it out by adding more plushy stuff. I'm pretty sure that I added more fluff once I went all the way around just because I wasn't totally happy with how thin the booty to tail connection was. Kind of a little fun fact here. The reason why I always attach my tails separately to my plushies is because it creates this natural seam between the body and the tail. I then use that as a guideline so that when I attach the legs to the plushie, I look at it and I'm able to attach the back of the thigh to the seam line of the tail, which both hides the seam of the tail and it gives me a nice firm attachment there, which is something that I actually learned by playing the video game Spore. Because when I started creating creatures in the game Spore, you were always left with this really weird kind of gap if you did what I did, which is you would take an arm, take the hand off, and then just stick the arm on the butt of your creation so that you had a really extra super duper long tail, because the natural spine in Spore would only go so long, and adding a handless arm would give you a super long tail that you could then modify to your heart's content. So that's where I learned how to do that, but I was always left with this really bizarre gap, and eventually one day I think I pushed the leg model back a little bit, and it filled in the gap with the leg, made it look super natural, gave it a beautifully curved thigh, and it was like, oh, well this works pretty good. So ever since then, I have applied that same technique to my sculptures, my plushies, my 3D models, literally everything I do. I know that the back of the hips attach right where the tail ends, right at that nice tight seam right there. So, you know, kind of a fun fact, but I thought it was something worth sharing that you guys might enjoy. Here I'm going through the effort of hand stitching those stripes on the tail that we cut out earlier. I was really hesitant on just making them part of the tail, but I felt like it was going to be too tight and that it would sort of distort the shape when I ran it through the sewing machine. So just to make sure that they didn't lose their shape, I hand stitched them on top of the fabric, and they still look pretty darn good. Like, it's really hard to tell that they were put on top of the fabric. There's only this teeny tiny little bump of a difference, but when you look at the plushie as a whole, you can't barely tell it's there. Like, they came out really, really well. Once you've got all the little bits on the tail attached, then you can finally move into the nearly finished piece, which is attaching the legs. As I stated in the last video, I always make my legs separately and then attach them to the plush later on, just because I want to be able to scoot them around and adjust them if the overall pose kind of gets messed up when I sew things together. This is personal preference. Like, if you make your legs into the actual pattern of your plush, that's totally fine, you know, don't sweat it. To each their own. I prefer doing it this way because I can adjust it as needed, and I can always trim the fabric or reposition things just to make sure that they all fit together. Once I pin them in place, I check the pose to make sure that it looks good, and then I sew on the back legs. Now, I kind of goofed here, and I'll fix it later on, way off camera, so you guys don't have to sit through and watch me do it, but when I positioned the back legs here, I liked the way they looked, but I should have pinned the front legs on to check the posture before doing so. Because once I attached the back legs and stuffed them and everything, I was like, okay, these look good. Yep, I like that. I then posed the front legs, sew them on, and when the plush was standing, it had this very, like, forward lean to it, which was somewhat intentional. Like, I kind of wanted the character to be leaning forward as if he's, like, standing on tippy toes. But he ended up leaning way too much forward. So I had to completely pop all my stitches off for the legs, reposition them, and then sew them back on. Kind of sucked, took a lot of time, but it's a prime example of why sewing my legs on separately is so important for me, because if they had been part of the actual fabric and the actual pattern and I had machine sewn them on, I would not have been able to pop them off. Like, they would have been a permanent mistake and he would have been leaning so far forward that he would tip over constantly. It was irritating, but it was what it was. I think this was also something that got cut from the last video, either because the video got corrupted or whatever. But when I stuff my leggies, I always sew along the top half, and then I stick fluff into the thigh until it reaches desired thickness. I like things to be thick with 2 C's, not 3. I'm sure I'll get a plush in the future that will be a 3C thick plush, but we shall see when that time comes. It's probably going to end up being like a wicker beast or something, I just know it. Oh, I look forward to making cool characters and species. It's so fun! You just ladder stitch the legs on until you get all the way back around, and take extra secure stitches right near the back of the tail, just to make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to stay. And then you can kind of fiddle around with the stuffing to flatten it out and move it into place. Once I stuff the leg, I do always check the other one to make sure that it is still lined up and that it stands level on the ground, because sometimes when you add that extra fluff, it will kind of suck the leg up into the body just a little bit, and it can throw off the posture. So just double check all the time. Always double check. When you think you've double checked enough, go back and triple check. Sewing the other leg on is pretty much the exact same method as sewing the first leg. Matter of fact, that's pretty much the same thing. The only thing I do want to note is when you're actually sewing the leg on, you kind of fold the fabric over ever so slightly and create like a little tunnel for your needle to go through when you are ladder stitching that on. The reason why is because it will help to hide the stitches a little bit, and it also adds like this nice crispy edge to where you can't see the raw edge of the fabric. It creates a nice like clean hemmed edge. Practice will definitely make this easier. There's not a whole lot I can really do to like physically show this being done, because it's such a teeny tiny little fold over. Like, my normal seam allowance is about 1/8 of an inch. This fold over is like 1/16 of an inch. Like, you can't barely tell I do it, but I feel like it does make a difference in the end. Perhaps it's just, you know, a personal thing, but try it out for yourself and see what you think. I also always tie a knot when I do the top half of the leg like that. Again, just to prevent it so that if seams pop, it's not going to mess with things. And then stick all that stuffing right up in those thighs. Fill them out nicely and make them look super duper cute. As this saying goes, thick thighs save lives. It's kind of a crazy thought when you realize that I've been sewing this plushie now, and throughout all the footage as I'm going back through and like editing it and talking to you guys, I have been talking for almost 45 minutes, and I'm sure my voice sounds like it. I've been drinking as much water as I can to keep the gravel away, but the gravel be coming. Once you get the feet attached, then you can sew on the little toe beans, which is something that got cut from my last video due to my camera being a turd. Basically, you just tie a small knot right at the very bottom of the foot, almost directly in the center, wrap the thread around the front of the toe, and then plunge it in directly at the point where the foot sort of curves. Once you plunge it all the way through, re-emerge through that bottom hole, tie a knot to secure it, and then just repeat this step with the other 2 toes until eventually you have 4 of them. And you'll see that this will force the fabric to sort of curl in, and it makes a toe-like shape, which always looks super cute. Just tie it off every so often, and that will definitely help. The important thing to keep in mind here is to use a really, really, really strong thread. I always use upholstery thread when I do toes, just because you pulling on it and you're adding a lot of stress, so you don't want to add too much and then kill it. It's very easy to break your thread, trust me. Adding small details like the horns and the frill crest, which unfortunately I did lose the footage for because my camera absolutely hates me when I start recording stuff. I think I have remedied this problem. I bought an adapter recently to help my camera stay alive when I'm trying to do recordings. So the next time I shoot a video, we'll see if it works. But it's basically just attaching it via ladder stitch, making sure that you go down both sides and secure it at each one of the little spines there, just so that it all comes together nicely. If you guys want tutorials on specifically doing small details like horns, fins, feathers, I don't know, like plating, I guess, like underbelly plating or anything of the kind where it's just like really detailed small things, please let me know in the comments below, and I will try my very best to make a tutorial like that for you guys, just to hopefully help you out. I do enjoy making tutorials and reading you guys' feedback. I read every single comment, so if you do have something you'd like to see, please let me know. I will most certainly try my best to do it. You can also kind of see how the posture of this plushie is really funked up here, and as I'm looking at it when I'm attaching the horns, I kept being really bothered by it, and it was just like, I don't like how much he's leaning forward. I have to change it. So after I attach this horn, I believe I go back and I actually fix the legs. So, you know, things happen. You live and learn, but it's one of those things that just happens. Like, I don't know what else to say about it. Sometimes plushies don't quite go exactly as I want them to, but they do always still turn out pretty darn cute. That is the one thing I really love about making them, is just how cute can I make this character? It would be cool if I got, like, commissioned to do a really spooky character, and my style just turns everything cute, so there's, like, this really spooky skull-faced character or something, or, like, maybe a zombie or something, and it just still turns out cute. That seems like something I would do. This is also where I'm going to sew the actual fingers into the wings. I start right up by the top of the wrist so that I can sew the little portion that's going to be the sail. Now, this is something you can do by hand, as always, but I find the machine makes the most beautiful tight crease, and it hides the stitches on the dark part super easy. The fact that it's black doesn't matter on the underside because I'm going to be putting fingers onto that manually that are black, so it will hide it. Just work your way along the pattern, making sure that you do so all the way down to the tip. Just be super careful when you go over that sewn edge, because you can very easily break your needle, especially if you're on the machine. Like, I think I broke probably 4 or 5 needles doing this. I'm aggressive to my poor machine. Anybody who's in a voice call with me when I'm sewing something, they hear the beep-a-beep of death when the machine breaks a needle. I try not to. I love this machine, but sometimes it just happens. Try to make sure that there is enough of a seam allowance here. I usually leave a good, probably 1/8 of an inch or so. I wouldn't say as much as a 1/4, maybe a 1/5 of an inch. It gives it enough of this gap inside so that when we get to go through and stick the wires into the wings right here, which is done by just coiling these aluminum wires, we just force them up into the wing, and it will allow you to make this wing not only posable, but it will help it to hold its shape so that it's not all super duper floppy and just falling all over the place. This is totally optional, like you don't have to do this. If you just want floppy wings, you can stop at this stage. You don't have to go through the effort of inserting a wire. I personally do because people love the fact that they can pose their plushies. But as I said, it is 100% optional. You don't have to do it. It's okay to not do it. It also takes a stupid amount of fiddling to try and get it all in there. I've definitely learned since making this plush how to do this a lot easier. It's trial and error, you know. After a while, you'll just kind of figure out something that works a lot easier and doesn't distort your wire horrendously like mine did here, where I was having so much trouble getting it through the arm of the plush because of how thick it was and I sewed it too tight right there. So I ended up having to like peel the fabric back in order to wrap the wire back up on itself. Way more work than it should have taken, but in the end, it worked out and it did what it was supposed to do. This is also the stage where I like to stick a little bit of fluff down into the wrist because it helps to kind of pad that out, and it also keeps the wire from shifting and moving around and kind of retracting from the fingers. I also stick some more fluff up inside the arm itself to pad it out, hide the wire so it's not super rough on your hands when you go to handle it, and it fluffs it up to make it actually look like a wing arm with muscles and stuff that were strong enough to power these wings into flight. At this stage, this is also where I go through the insanely tedious process of pinning on these little wing arms? Wing arms, I think? Yeah. Because the character had black wing arms and fingers and stuff, I wanted to make sure that I could include a detail like that, but because they were so tiny and intricate, I was really afraid that they would distort the pattern. So I ended up just going through and manually hand sewing them on, which takes a stupid amount of time to do, but the end result is just so pretty, and it also allows me to make any small modifications that I need to if it appears too thick in one area, or if there's like a little gap of white that shows through. You can also see that I trim off the excess here. It's always a better idea to cut more than you think you need so that you can cut off excess, but rather than not having enough. This part is also going to take absolutely forever to do, so while I'm sewing away and attaching fingers, I'm going to take a minute to talk to you guys about what I mentioned earlier, which is your opportunity for a free plushie. I recently hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is absolutely phenomenal, and I cannot thank you guys enough for such outstanding support. Like, it is the craziest thought that just 2 months ago, my channel was just barely at 100 subscribers, and now I'm over 1,000. Like, that is incredible growth. What did I do to deserve you guys? You are so awesome. So to give back to you, I figured I would make a free plushie raffle. There'll be a link in the description to the Twitter post that has all the information, but I'll go over it here. The raffle is for a character that is pre-designed. Look at this character. Isn't he lovely? It's a lovely shark dragon. The species and gender and element and age and everything is totally up to the auction winner, or raffle winner, excuse me. This is a completely free to enter raffle. All you have to do is go to my Twitter post containing this raffle, hit the like, make sure that you follow my content, and share the page. Easy peasy. Just like that, you've been entered to win this custom plush completely free. The only thing is, obviously you're gonna have to pay the shipping if you do win. Shipping happens. If you would like this plush sent to you, just wait till the raffle wins and then we can hash things out, and I'm sure we can come to some sort of agreement to ship this plush off to you and send it and just have all sorts of fun and awesomeness. I'm super happy with how the plush itself is looking so far. If you troll through my Twitter, I'm sure you can see some of the work in progresses that I've posted. But I will be uploading a video relatively soon that will sort of show off the plushie and contain more information about the raffle. So you can always go check that out when that video comes out if you want to do that then, or you can enter now. The raffle is going to go on until August 11th, so you have plenty of time to enter still. Ta-da! A lovely sewn wing that is totally poseable. Nifty-fifty. Okay, so unfortunately, once again, lost all the footage of me attaching the wings and doing the feet beans, so I'm going to try my best to explain how I did this. Basically, I take puffy paint and draw on the actual paw pad itself, and then once that puffy paint is dry, I go over top of it with crystal clear hot glue. This seals the puffy paint and creates a mirror-like effect on it so that the bean is nice and three-dimensional and it won't stick to anything, which is super important because puffy paint likes to stick to varnished wood for some odd reason. I also lost the footage of me making the eyes here, so as best as I can describe it, I cut out the main color, which in this case was a nice sky blue, from a felt. I then put puffy paint to draw on where the iris and pupil go. Because this character has solid colored eyes, I just put the pupil in there. And then I usually use either Sharpie or fabric paint in order to add some pseudo shading to the eyes because it just makes them really pop. Once all that is dried completely, then I go over it with the final details such as the white highlights and the nice black pupil in the center if the character has one. Position them on the face where you want them to go, and then just slowly but surely whip stitch until they get all the way attached. It's important to keep in mind that you want them to be as clean on your edges as possible. Keep all your stitches as nice and similar, I guess. Like evenly spaced. I think evenly spaced is a better description of it. Make sure that you extra secure at the corner of the eye, and then plunge your needle completely through the head to the opposing side so that it's like mirror imaged. Tie a knot to keep the thread from distorting, put it in the corner of the eye, position them so that they're perfectly symmetrical, and you can stick a pin in there just to keep it from shifting around before you sew, and repeat all the steps that you did with the other eye. One of the things that is really important to keep in mind is to always make sure that your character's eyes are more so in the front of their face, but not totally right in the center. Because if you put their eyes directly in the center, you'll kind of get the fisheye effect where it looks like they're looking two different directions. But if you make the pupil too close to the center of the eye, like near the forward, when you attach the eyes, they'll look seriously cross-eyed, and it looks so derpy. I find that it's a good rule of thumb to kind of go 3/4 of the eye forward. That's like the best position in which to put the pupil so that it doesn't look super duper derpy. But there is one additional step that we're going to do rather than just sewing the eyes on to kind of help pull the expression together. I don't know why my camera likes to die at like the most important parts of plush making, because it's not like I can go back and change it or just be like, oh look, here we are. But you can see here that with the eyes sewn on, they do look kind of derpy. We need to bring the edges of the face in right at the corners of the eye in order to fix the facial expression. To do this, I usually pick a color thread that's the same color as the face just to hide it, or the same color as the eyes, depending on what color the plush is. It really varies. Here I'm using a nice black thread because I'm going to cover this up anyway. Go right in the corner of the eye and make sure you have a nice and secured knot in there. Plunge the thread completely through to the other tear duct. My camera didn't want to focus here, so I apologize. Plunge all the way through, and then go back in and re-emerge out the other side. Once you've done this, you've sort of created a little bridge on the inside so that when you then pull your thread completely tight, you will see it forces the eyes in towards the center of the face. You then have to pull it really tight and tie a knot in order to keep it from distorting. But you can see there that that totally fixed the facial expression. I usually pass the thread through a couple more times just to make absolutely sure that they can't pop and break open. And then I re-emerge through one of the nostrils and tie usually 3 or 4 knots in order to create a little nose. Do the same thing with the other side, just repeatedly tying knots over themselves to bulk up the thread right there, and then plunge it through 2 or 3 times before re-emerging out the bottom of the mouth tie a knot to keep it from shifting around. And then when you go to sew the actual smile on, I usually go a little bit behind the pupil so that when I pull the thread, it will distort the plush face ever so slightly and create that sort of smiling grin effect. It also gives the lips more 3-dimension. Tie a small knot, loop it back around to make it twice as thick, and then do the same thing with the other side. Look at how cute that looked. It's just a small little detail, but I find that it goes a really long way. When you're finished with the mouth, just plunge the thread all the way through and tie off a knot somewhere at the top just to prevent it from slipping out, and then you can cut off the excess thread and let it sink back into the plushie. Now we're going to do the final effect, which is to use E6000 and a tiny little strip of felt to create an upper eyelid and soften the expression of this character. It is super duper important here to keep in mind that this E6000 is insanely toxic. Please, please, please wear a mask and have a fan or work in a well-ventilated area. I have a fan off camera that I'm using to blow the smell out of this room because this stuff is seriously bad for you. Do not inhale it, do not ingest it, and if you don't trust your fingers to not touch it, wear gloves. Please, please, please. Keep your health in mind. This stuff is seriously toxic. Basically, you just cut a piece of this felt that's long enough to cover the upper eye, dab on a little bit of the E6000, and then ever so gently lay it over the top of the eye. It softens that wide-eyed expression and makes it look much more natural and relaxed. And you can just see how amazing and awesome that makes this eyes look. This is usually the final detail that I put on plushies, so as soon as this is done, the actual plush itself is completely finished. I'm so happy with how he came out, and he just looks so cute and snuggly. Looks exactly like the character too, which is really, really spectacular. I always love when I can capture a character's pose and personality in a plush. Boy, that was a lot of alliteration. What is it with me and alliteration with plushies, I tell ya. It's just something I enjoy to do, I suppose. I'm really, really pleased with his overall expression. His feet beans came out incredibly adorable, and I'm definitely going to be doing this method for all future plushies. His wings are all very poseable, so of course you can bend the membranes and they'll spring back to where they need to go. They can hold poses, you can move them all around, and they're securely stitched, so no matter how much fiddling and farting you do, they're gonna stay where they're supposed to stay, which is always good. He's got a nice, lovely big wingspan, and just overall super duper cute plush. I'm so happy with it. Bye-bye, Sovereign! I hope you enjoy your new home! Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I know it's been a lengthy one, and I'm so sorry if you don't like my longer videos. I tried to do this as quickly as possible, but sometimes when making art, it's either do one really long video or two 30-minute ones, so I figured I would just say, meh, let's save the upload speed and we'll go ahead and just do one big one. If you do enjoy my work, please consider checking out my Patreon. It helps me do day-to-day things, as well as funds future projects so that I can make more interesting stuff, like plushies. Without my patrons and my supporters, I wouldn't be able to do things like this and produce more content for you guys. You're always more than welcome to check out the link, but if not, you're still awesome just for checking out my videos and sitting through them. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to watch my content, and especially when you leave a comment and provide some feedback. That's super duper awesome. I do have to give a shout out to Osmium Dragon, who has been holding strong at the $25 tier, and you are such an amazing, amazing help to me. Seriously, that little bit of help goes such a long way. Thank you so, so, so much. But as always, I do so thank you very much for watching my video. I hope you have a most wonderful day and a fantastic life.
Ain't no place to hide, ain't no one to run to.